This
Good evening,
conference will
everyone.
now be recorded.
Welcome to the November 17th South Whitehall Township Planning Commission meeting. Everyone please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, the Republic for which it stands, God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. Mr. Adams, can you do the roll call?
Absolutely. Trevor Dombach.
Here.
Tim Dugan.
Here.
Andrew Flagg.
Here.
Brian Height.
Here.
Diane Kelly.
Here.
Mark Luth.
Here.
David Wilson.
Here.
7 present, sufficient for a quorum.
Mr. Adams, can you do the meeting rules?
Absolutely. For an orderly meeting wherein all attendees may be fully able to participate, we ask that you adhere to the following rules. Please mute your microphone or telephone to avoid background noise that may cause interference in the meeting and make it difficult for others to hear. Staff may mute the microphones of remote attendees if needed. Public questions and comments will be taken at periodic intervals throughout the agenda. We will start with no time limits, but the Planning Commission chairman may impose a time limitation if there are many questions or if the meeting is running short on time. For in-person attendees, please raise your hand to be recognized, then move to the podium when directed and state your name, address, and comment or question. Please turn on the podium microphone before speaking and turn it off when done. For remote attendees, the chat box features will be active throughout the meeting. If you have a comment or question, please type your full name and address in the chat box. Is that still the speech icon somewhere? In the upper right. When you are recognized and so directed, please unmute your microphone and state your comment or question. Please mute your microphone when done. For those who are accessing the meeting by phone only, staff will periodically ask for caller comments and unmute all callers. Callers must identify their name and address prior to making a comment. Your cooperation and adherence to these rules will ensure an orderly and respectful meeting. Thank you.
All right, everyone in the audience, we're on agenda item number 3, review and approval of the September 15th meeting minutes. Does anyone have any comments or edits?
I believe Monica Hodges stated that it was Crete, C-R-E-T-E Schaefer, not Creek Schaefer. And that was on page 6 of 10.
I have one, page 10 of 10, paragraph 8. And I don't want to speak for you, Mr. Luth, but I believe you referenced LVPC and not LCCD because the 10,000 square feet impervious is. Any other comments? Does someone want to make a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve.
We have a second.
Second.
Mr. Adams, can you do the roll call?
Trevor Dombach.
Here. We do.
Aye.
Oh, aye. Sorry. Rolls. My fault.
Sorry.
Long day.
Tim Dugan.
Aye.
Andrew Flagg.
Aye.
Brian Height.
Aye.
Diane Kelly.
Aye.
Mark Luth.
Aye.
David Wilson.
Aye.
Motion passes 7-0.
Agenda item number 4, Mr. Manhart, would you like to do the comprehensive plan review?
Yes, so just as an update for the comprehensive plan, our last workshop meeting, there was a lot of discussion around neighborhood corridor. We have been incorporating neighborhood corridors into neighborhood residential because part of the concern revolved around what was designated a corridor, what wasn't. So we felt that there was a lot of pieces of the neighborhood corridor that were important. So we incorporated it into neighborhood residential because it was all in neighborhood residential anyway. And then hopefully the intent is to look at corridors when we get to the active transportation plan. We'll identify pedestrian corridors and origin and destinations. So that'll help us identify corridors on a more specific level. So we're in the process of incorporating those changes into that section. And we will bring those back at the December meeting. The other piece is we want to hopefully finalize the implementation items. So those were sent out to everyone. Please comment. We actually could use help on these because there's a lot of them. And we may have missed important things with each of them. So any comments you can provide would be helpful and appreciated. So after those two items are done, we should have a pretty quick turnaround to incorporate that into the draft plan, which may, depending on how that workshop meeting goes, we could most likely have the draft plan prepared and ready for the next planning commission meeting, which is the following Thursday, which we could potentially open it to public comment should the planning commission wish to.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Agenda item number 5, subdivision review. We have Montar Group LLC self-storage facility. Mr. Adams, would you like to do the staff presentation?
Yes. This is an application to further develop the properties located at 3350 and 3354 Walbert Avenue. The plan proposes to consolidate the two parcels, raise the existing residential and agricultural structures, and construct a 3-story, 112,800 square foot self-storage facility, a 16-space parking lot, and associated stormwater management facilities on the 2.007 acre parcel. The property is served by public water and public sewer and is zoned General Commercial 1, Special Height Limitation, GC1. 3354 Walbert Avenue Associates, LP is the owner. TAC Allentown, LLC is the applicant. This plan was reviewed by the Planning Commission at its August 18th, 2022 meeting, where it was taken under advisement. The Zoning Hearing Board granted a number of, the Zoning Hearing Board granted special exception approval with a number of conditions. The Community Development Department recommends that the Planning Commission take the plan under advisement to afford the applicant the time necessary to address the reviewing agency's comments. Our recommendation is contingent upon the applicant granting the township a waiver from the time frame in which to act upon the plan. I will skip the next part. So that's it. Oh, I'm sorry. The soft Planning Commission deadline to act on the plan is December 19th, 2022. The Board of Commissioners' hard deadline to act on the plan is January 18th, 2023.
Thank you. The applicant may do their presentation.
Good evening. My name is Mary Bockert. I'm with Bowler Engineering, the engineering firm representing Montar and TAC. As you can see, we're back. We were here last time and you had asked to see renderings of the building. So we do have that this time if you'd like to see them, or I can answer any general questions that you have since the last time we were before you. Yes, please. Yeah. So here we have two views of the building as you are standing basically on Walbert Avenue, this coming down the main drive. And the other one would be if you were driving up Walbert to the west, basically from that main intersection. And I do also have the applicant here, Frank, if you have any questions about the materials, finishes.
I have a question. What's the status of your HOP permit with PennDOT?
We have scoping comments resolved, and we are resubmitting a full HOP plan set tomorrow.
And have they given any advice on direction for ingress and egress?
So far, they have not commented beyond the full access driveway that's shown. They said they're reserving additional comments, if any, once they see a full plan set. So we should have technical comments in 30 days.
Would the applicant anticipate anything more than normal, like residential vehicles coming in here? Or could it be commercial, semi-commercial vehicles of length and size?
Frank, I believe it is mostly residential, but we have run a truck term accommodating a small box truck.
Thank you.
My understanding is you've been coordinating with township staff and you're willing to take this under advisement. The frontage improvements are a big item. Without having the PennDOT comments, there's a lot of variables in play, but I know there's been a lot of progress with the plans and a lot of the comments have been addressed.
Yep.
Does anyone have any other comments, questions? Anyone from the audience or online? All right.
What happens with PennDOT?
All right, well, we'll take this under advisement. Do
I'll make a motion to take the plan under advisement.
we have a second?
I'll second.
Trevor Dombach.
Abstain.
Tim Dugan.
Aye.
Andrew Flagg.
Aye.
Brian Height.
Aye.
Diane Kelly.
Aye.
Mark Luth.
Aye.
David Wilson.
Aye.
Motion passes 6-0.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll see you back here in a little while.
All right, we're on agenda item number 6, zoning amendment, Sri Mata 4365 text amendment. Mr. Adams, would you like to do the staff presentation?
Yes, indeed. Oh, boy. At the September 7th, 2022 Board of Commissioner meeting, the applicant approached the Board of Commissioners to request a zoning ordinance text amendment to add 2 new uses to the required majority uses that define a shopping center, and to add 2 shopping centers the off-street parking reductions for size currently existing within the minimum off-street parking calculations within coordinated developments. They presented that the Dorneyville Shopping Center no longer meets the definition of shopping center within the zoning ordinance because retail sales and personal services businesses no longer make up the majority of the primary use space. They also presented that the coordinated development enjoys a reduction of required parking based on the size of the primary use, while shopping centers, which are a subset of coordinated developments, do not. They presented that they are proceeding through the land development process to add a fast food restaurant pad to their shopping center, but require a number of variances and/or favorable interpretations from the zoning hearing board in order to proceed. They presented that they met with staff to discuss the options and afterwards determined that it would be unlikely be granted said variances and that requesting a text amendment would be a more reasonable approach. They presented that the aforementioned text amendment would be useful to all shopping centers within the township, as all shopping centers were experiencing the same market shifts that Dorneyville Shopping Center was experiencing. The Board of Commissioners directed the applicant to pursue both the text amendment application to the Planning Commission and the Zoning Hearing Board appeal application to the Zoning Hearing Board. The applicant has submitted an appeal application on July 20th, 2022. On September 13th, 2022, the applicant submitted a text amendment application to the Planning Commission. Staff reminds Planning Commission to consider the implications of the zoning ordinance amendment across all shopping centers, existing and potential, in the township when considering the proposed amendment. Unless you want me to continue, I will turn this over to the applicant for their presentation.
Please step forward.
I'm sorry. I'll start again. My name is William Malcolmus. I'm attorney at 509 West Linden Street, Allentown, Pennsylvania. I represent the Sri Mata group. First of all, I want to thank your staff, Greg Adams and Laura Harrier. We met with them a number of times to review this matter, and they were very, very helpful, and they had some very good suggestions. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is we reviewed their report. We think their report covers the matter beautifully. We agree with their recommendations with respect to the text amendment of the zoning ordinance. And anecdotally, I might say that I represented the applicant, the previous owners of this shopping center, I think in 1989. And at that time, we went to the zoning hearing board and we received a variance from the zoning hearing board because we were able to convince the zoning hearing board that under the regulations, the parking regulations, which were in effect at that time, there was more than adequate parking, and they gave us a variance at that time. I've also represented Tillman Square at times. 2 different times I went to the zoning hearing board because under the regulations which were in effect at that time, they didn't have enough parking, but absolutely they had more than enough parking. And the zoning hearing board granted us 2 applications for variances with respect to parking. And one other one, some years ago, I represented the Roma Center. It's not a shopping center, but the commercial center. And there was a problem with the parking there, parking requirements at that time, because under the parking requirements which were in effect, the zoning hearing board, the zoning officer had to recognize each class of tenant. And the problem was that the Roma Shopping Center, or the Roma Commercial Center, had a lot of commercial tenants. And as a result, they were at the point where they could not rent one of the floors because they could not meet the parking requirements. We went to the Board of Commissioners, and the Board of Commissioners made an appropriate change so that building is fully tenanted. So we also presented, and I hope you've had an opportunity to review the 2 add-ons we have. One from the morning call with respect to the shopping center in Salisbury Township, which is probably half vacant. And in that, the broker said, you will find evidence of this across the nation as medical facilities, churches, fitness centers, vocational schools, etc., take large chunks of space and require retail type locations as consumers demand non-stop shopping conveniences. And that's why we were asking you to amend the zoning regulations so that we can fill up the Dorneyville Shopping Center, because at the moment we do not meet the requirements to be a shopping center. The other add-on is a national thing, which is the concluding portion of our presentation. And it says prohibited uses in modern shopping center era. And some of the uses that we have would not be, traditionally, they would not be considered a fit facilities in a shopping center. but at the current time, you need those facilities in order to fill up a shopping center. So obviously, you don't want to have vacant shopping centers. Any questions?
I do. Um, There's no doubt that the retail spectrum is changing
Right.
and retail usage is being redefined. My question for you, though, is if there's an acceptance of lower parking spots required for the development and a pad location like is described is contemplated, does the person who's developing this understand that that pad development still needs to come in front of the township for zoning and planning
Oh, yes,
considerations
yes.
and approval? And just because you have the space doesn't grant you the opportunity to build.
That's absolutely right. And we have a meeting with the zoning hearing board coming up. And your staff made one poignant observations. This is on page 3 of 5. It says, shopping center operators are likely well informed as to the parking needs of their tenants and will be directly impacted by poor planning for these needs. A shopping center that fails to provide sufficient parking for its tenants will likely lose tenants at a higher rate than its competitors and will attract fewer new tenants. It's essentially a self-managed thing because anybody who has a shopping center and does not manage their facilities properly will be a failure. And I think that's a good point that was raised by your staff.
Thank you. And I just want to clarify for everyone in the audience, this zoning text amendment is not a land development. There's no proposed land development
Right.
going on. And the applicant understands if they propose a new building, they'll have to submit plans and go through the whole
Exactly right.
land development process. I do appreciate your coordination with township staff. I know there was a lot of back and forth and you came to come up with these text amendments. So I appreciate that. And there's really two parts to this text amendment, and please correct me if I'm wrong. The first part is including restaurant and recreational facilities such as a fitness center, athletic center in the definition of a shopping center to be included within the 50%. So I think that is needed in our ordinance to bring us up to speed with the times. Shopping centers with online shopping being more prevalent now, shopping centers are more experience-based to get people to do things other than just shop. So a fitness center, people go there to exercise. A restaurant, people go there to sit down and experience a nice meal. So I think that's really needed. The second part is reducing the parking requirements. And a lot of times parking requirements are a bit overkill, in my opinion. And by allowing these reductions in the larger shopping centers, it allows for the shared parking that happens. I'm in favor of it. That's just my opinion.
I have a question for the applicant. I believe you were before this board last year for a pad restaurant in the parking lot. What is the status of that?
We have, I'm sorry, no, go ahead, no, go ahead.
Yeah, that is currently, it's still active, but it's on hold essentially until either, this matter is resolved either by text amendment or zoning variance.
Thank you. And this particular shopping center that we're talking about, the Aldi's grocery store opened today. Wonderful tenant that you have there. Thank you. I actually drove by today and the parking lot was pretty full. Very nice to see. I did notice that there are several restaurants currently in that shopping center, and there's also a gym, a taekwondo type business, and then a bounce you, some type of children's business. So you currently have these businesses in your shopping center? Is that correct?
Yes.
And you're looking,
Well, we still have vacancies.
Yeah, there's a few vacancies that still need to be filled.
I'm sorry, this is Scott Patersky. He's our engineer.
Good to see you again.
I guess I'm questioning, maybe it's a question for staff. So
Back this up a little bit. So the definition of the shopping center, 50% of the uses have to fall into that category. Currently, as the tenants in this shopping center, they do not meet the definition of shopping center because 50% of the space is not occupied by
Retail or personal.
retail, personal, service. And like you mentioned, it's primarily restaurant and recreational. So that's why those two are, and we're seeing that across a lot of our shopping centers. So that's why those two uses are added to that 50% calculation.
So currently now with the new grocery store, what is the calculation percentage?
I don't-
Obviously, it's
yeah.
changed since
Yes, it
the
has
last time the
changed.
township has assessed this.
Yes, and I don't know what the current is. I do believe that if you add restaurants and recreation facilities to the definition, this will put you over the 50%, I think by a fairly significant amount.
But we had calculated the percentage of retail or personal service, and it didn't meet the 50%. It was just under, it was only a couple percentage points. It was very close, but it didn't quite make it. So therefore, it was classified as a coordinated development in lieu of a shopping center.
But we're
Scott-
talking about this as a universal change too, not just strictly to the Torreyville Shopping Center.
Correct,
You know,
but I'm
that-
just curious, with the addition of the new grocery store, did that change your calculations?
Actually, the calculation was based on that because we knew it was coming. It was under construction for some time. So that the percentage is including the Aldi.
Thank you.
So if all these open, when we go to the zoning hearing board, the zoning hearing board will have the experience of having all these open.
Correct.
So that won't be a mystery.
With the Aldis, it still does not give them what they need, which is they can't utilize the recreation facilities and the restaurants because the recreation facilities and the restaurants are not part of the 50% primary calculation. So even with the Aldis now, it does not bring them to over the 50%. So because we're seeing so many restaurants and recreation facilities in the shopping centers, we feel it would be helpful to add them to the 50%. So right now we have 2 uses that we use to get to the 50%. We'd like to increase that to the 4 uses to get them to the 50%. So I think to your question to the Aldis, no, it did not bring them to the 50%.
Thank you.
And you see how big it was today, and it still did not help them. So
Thank you.
Yeah, I feel if 50% of a shopping center has to be retail sales and personal service business, shopping centers are going to have a lot of vacancies. Just the environment in today's world. So I do like adding restaurant into that and recreation.
Well, and I should add that I don't believe that adding that particularly will drive down the tenant space in shopping centers. The people who own shopping centers will still look for tenants. They will get whatever they can bring in. The difficulty then becomes with staff, because if we start to lose our shopping centers parking is calculated on a flat number of 1 space for every 225 square feet of primary use space. It's very easy to do. If instead we had Tillman Square, for example, one of our largest ones, be a coordinated development, we would actually be going back to how we calculated off-street parking 15 years ago, when we would have to tally up every tenant space, calculate them individually based on their use, and then keep a running total of that, which becomes a large amount of staff time devoted to that, just keeping track of the tenants as they come and go, how much space is related to each and how much space generates a minimum parking requirement for each tenant. So I don't believe this really changes too much from the developer side, but from the staff point of view, you are significantly reducing the zoning officer's workload.
And the other caveat here is this is just the category of shopping center for how we calculate parking. It's not like we're losing shopping centers. We could potentially lose things that are categorized as shopping centers, which triggers this parking calculation. And then they would get shifted into coordinated development, which has a much more onerous parking calculation. So part of this is to simplify it for staff in evaluating and generating these parking requirements. So that's the other kind of flip side of this.
Dave, can you comment on page 70, one of the considerations that you presented or commentary for us states to consider the worst case scenario for underparked. Is there available parking immediately surrounding the area within a walkable distance? What would be the implication with customers taking advantage of nearby parking if it's available? Are potential customers more likely to walk a greater distance from off-site parking? Or are they more likely to simply take their business elsewhere? Can you expand on your thinking there and help us understand?
So this is kind of born out of some conversations we've had internally. In the planning world, the topic of parking comes up a lot. And the idea of market-driven versus regulated. So in this case, if there was no parking requirements, the business owner and the shopping center owner would provide enough parking so his business is going to be successful. And it's market demand. So if he has a problem with parking, he's either going to decrease his tenants, change his tenant types, try and increase parking so that he has a successful business. So that's kind of the market side. And then the regulated side is where we prescribe you need a minimum parking standard of 1 per 225, or it's based on each use. So that's kind of in general, like planning theory kind of thing. So whether it's free market or regulated. And the example that you referenced is if it was on that under that free market type scenario, the shopping center owner is going to do his best to be a successful shopping center, have tenants that want to locate there. If there isn't enough parking, the customers are likely going to go elsewhere. They'll drive around the parking lot. In my case, I wouldn't drive around the parking lot. I'd just move on because I'm not very patient. But others may drive around and look for a space and park and walk, but they may come into the business and say, I had a hard time parking. I may not be coming back. And then that's kind of a trigger for the shopping center manager to look at some of the other uses, or when a tenant comes in, he's going to start looking and trying to determine the mix of uses that fits his parking. I hope that made sense.
Oh, it completely does. I mean, at the end of the day, and too, also that his tenants might feel the need that there's not enough parking for their business and they go to someplace else that has better parking. I think market dictates quite a bit of, we have to provide sort of a guideline. But I think we also need to recognize that commercial, don't get me wrong when I say this, commercial's dead, it's dying on the vine. It's harder and harder to sell things in a brick and mortar store as opposed to e-commerce. So we need to sort of continue to adapt with today's environment and foster the remaining retail stores that we have. Keep them full.
Another just benefit I just would add in is, if these shopping centers have excess of parking, that's a lot of extra impervious surfaces that aren't really necessary, burdens the storm sewer system and things things like that. I think that was a comment made by the township engineer, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. So aside from just, is there enough parking, which, historically and other studies we've done, though I can't, nothing quantitative, but qualitatively, we did look at one data point, the Dorneyville Shopping Center a few years ago, and we came up with a rate of parking based on actual parking counts ratioed with the square foot of occupied space. And it was even far under what the parking would be, with this amendment. I think that in the table here, and with the amendment, the current required is 487. With the amendment, it would be 414. And based on the rate that we calculated, based on the actual count, made a ratio by the occupied square foot, we had about 360 space requirements. So the parking demand was well under, and that's a lot of, considering, say, a new shopping center, right? Not just for current shopping centers that are coming in. It's a lot of impervious, a lot of costs, a lot of our storm pipes are only so big. A lot of them are, aging, and someone's got to replace those. And it's often not the private developer. It's going to be burden the municipality to replace those pipes if get full under their ownership and maintenance responsibility.
Does anyone in the audience have any questions or comments? Anyone online? Please come to the podium and state your name.
Hi, my name is Harish Joshi. I'm the owner, one of the owners of the shopping mall. There's one thing I want to say. I purchased this mall 10 years back, and it was completely full, including bottom dollar. Now it's Aldi, completely full, 100% occupied. And we had no parking complaint at all at that time. Now, bottom dollar replaced by Aldi, and we have right now three vacancy, 23%. Mall is like about 77% occupied. So we have right now, say the Aldi is opening date, it is the ground opening, so you will see lots of traffic. But you see normal Aldi drive around at this study, they have 15 to 20 cars come in and out. Because the ground opening, so you see everything full, you see lots of parking there, space. But if you say normal Aldi, it's about 15, 20 cars parking there. What I plan to say that when I purchased mall 10 years back, Aldi was occupied by the bottom dollar, 100% occupancy, with no parking complaint. I've been Township board, you should have gotten any complaint about it. Now we're adding only small 2,000 square feet restaurant. So I don't understand, what it's all about. So I'm layman, I'm just,
Thank you for your comments.
thank you.
Does anyone want to make a motion?
I'll make a motion to change the text as proposed.
I'll second it. Mr. Adams, can you do a roll call?
I can. Trevor Dombach.
Aye.
Tim Dugan.
Aye.
Andrew Flagg. Brian Height.
Aye.
Diane Kelly.
Nay.
Mark Luth.
Aye.
David Wilson.
Aye.
Motion passes 5-2.
So just the next steps in the process for this text amendment, it then goes to BOC.
Yes.
And we run it through that process.
We're on agenda item 6B, requirement for planning commission review of special exception appeals.
Okay. This is a staff-generated ordinance amendment, which I believe has been directed to the Planning Commission from the Board of Commissioners. Background information: at least 2 recent commercial land developments have required special exception approval by the Zoning Hearing Board prior to Planning Commission review. Staff noticed that there is no codified method of providing input to the Zoning Hearing Board with regard to the reasonable conditions and safeguards that the Zoning Hearing Board may attach to the special exception approval. Staff opined that the Planning Commission may be able to provide Zoning Hearing Board with valuable insight to the land development implications of the special exception approval. Staff has researched surrounding municipalities with regards to methods utilized to achieve this goal and has incorporated the most applicable language in drafting the proposed amendment. Staff notes that the residential special exception approval is required for only one residential use, which is currently the detached accessory dwelling unit. Such a use does not require land development approval. At their October 5th, 2022 meeting, the Board of Commissioners directed staff to move forward with the proposed zoning ordinance amendment. So basically speaking, what we're doing is looking at section 350.16I of the zoning ordinance, which covers special exceptions. For some of you who've been through a few conditional use hearings, you will notice that the special exception gives some general information first, and then it lists the general criteria that is common to all special exceptions in this case. I believe these are either exactly the same or very similar to the conditional use general criteria that you've worked with before. So that's what's there now. Page 81 and 82 show that in green. That is the existing ordinance as it stands. So what staff has put together is on page 82, 3, 4, and 5 are the changes. And you will note that I stays the same. We then renumber the subsections. So instead of A, which then lists all of the general criteria, that becomes 1. And the general conditions stay the same, with the exception of D, which for some reason Chapter 11 escaped all of the changes that we had looked at before. So that should be actually changed to Chapter 312, which is the current saldo. Then we added 2, a subsection. So this is on the same level of general conditions. This adds the Planning Commission review. And this basically runs through the process. So A determines what has to happen. A sketch plan is submitted to the zoning officer, so it's properly noticed, and well, runs through all of that. Should engineering or legal be required, the applicant should submit a professional staff consultation to cover that. Should it be a sketch plan application, that's already covered. B covers special exception review for applications requiring land development, and that's the one very similar to the Eck Road or the Wawa, where both of them are special exception uses that are also land development. So B is what you would see, I think, a good number of times. And that describes how that gets done. Now, obviously, we've got to make some changes here because there's 2 Bs, so that should be re-lettered. C should be B, the second B, and then D, E, and F will follow. So this is the process. The second B describes the advisory report that the Planning Commission would provide. And it gives you the list of items that you would be looking at and commenting upon. It's a fairly comprehensive list, but it does list other features. So if you want to throw in something outside that list, that's fine, as long as it's in your purview. And then once you review that and make comments, you then might consider recommending some reasonable conditions and safeguards to be attached to the special exception that would then be placed before the Zoning Hearing Board for their consideration. Subsection C The Planning Commission can also recommend to the Board of Commissioners that the Township Solicitor be sent to the Zoning Hearing Board. The Board of Commissioners need not take the recommendation, but it is a recommendation the Planning Commission can make. Subsection D is the time limitation. This states that the Planning Commission shall file its advisory report with the zoning officer as soon as practicable, but no more than 45 days from the date of the meeting. This gives you a time limitation, but it also then gives a standard for what happens if the Planning Commission decides not to send or the report does not make it for some reason, which then allows the Zoning Hearing Board to continue on with the special exception process, not be held up by the lack of a Planning Commission report. This basically tells the Planning Commission, you've got 45 days to get your work done. If you don't get the work done, then the Zoning Hearing Board may proceed without you. It's not necessarily a shall, it's a may. The next subsection, consistency of applications, just ensures that the plans viewed by Planning Commission are exactly the same plans that will be reviewed by the Zoning Hearing Board. And that any changes in one means that they're basically both have to go back to get a review on the same plan from both boards. And then finally, 3, that states that the Zoning Hearing Board shall not approve a special exception review without seeing the Planning Commission advisory report unless the 45-day period has passed, at which point they can determine if they want to wait or if they can simply continue with the process without the advisory report. So that's what we've got there. This is your first look at it. We're open to comments. We're not asking for a recommendation tonight if you don't want to. If you want to sit on this and chew on it for a bit, become more comfortable, we're open to that. So I'm now opening the floor to comments.
I had a question, or maybe more of a comment. So it's more of timing. So the Planning Commission has the ability to recommend to the Board of Commissioners to potentially send our solicitor and engineer to zoning. So for example, if this evening we had a sketch plan, the Zoning Hearing Board is meeting on November 30th and December 1st. There wouldn't be sufficient time for the Planning Commission to get a message to the Board of Commissioners for them to vote in a public meeting to send the solicitor. Is there a way that we can build in time to?
Oh, sorry, thank you. Should something like this take effect, what happens is when the zoning officer would receive an application, first and foremost, she would make the applicant aware that the special exception request must go to the Planning Commission for the advisory report. It doesn't start moving. So the dates get looked at, and if we need a time extension from the hearing to place it, that's all going to work out prior to. The example of tonight versus going to the 30th, it's too late after the fact. So I don't want to use that as an example because it would all start at the beginning when they come in. So if they came in to me and asked for this special exception, first step is you go to the Planning Commission for an advisory report. It's the exact same process that we use for the conditional use now.
Okay.
And a majority of the time, this is in place in municipalities. This is not unique here that we're asking for this.
Correct.
I found it unique that it is not in place here.
I agree. I appreciate you bringing this for our consideration. I just wanted to check on the timing to make sure that we can allow sufficient
And it
time for the
actually
board.
allows the Board of Commissioners to have knowledge of every case before it happens, prior to after.
Correct. And then enough time for the solicitor and engineer to
Yeah,
review.
all the
before they
timing
make a presentation.
all the timing will be there. And there's continuances that can be signed and waivers of time extensions and so forth and so on, should it be required. So that's really a non-issue. It's getting it up in forefront and getting the Planning Commission to do the advisory report, just like in the conditional uses, so that the Board of Commissioners is aware of a project that's coming in. should they want township representation.
Do we need to spell out within this document exactly what you just said about timing when a special exception comes to you as a zoning officer has the authority to A, B, and C so that it's memorialized and not?
We absolutely can revisit this and put that language more user-friendly. Absolutely.
Okay. And my second question has to do with the advisory report itself. I know we kind of touched on this at our last meeting. I just want to make sure that we're providing that if the planning commission decides not to make comments, should we build into this that we would send a document saying that we don't have
Yes,
any comments so that
there
there
should
is?
be a response either way, whether,
Okay.
that, that it was looked at and reviewed and there are no comments.
So I didn't see language in here that jumped out at me that secured that. Is there something that we can
think that
change the
can be-
language?
We can
Yeah, or, I mean, the advisory
report will be-
report could say
Will be
no change.
given
or
and it
no
will
rec-
say no change.
Yes.
Yeah,
But there
exactly. Yeah.
will be a
The report
document.
the report can be anything. If your recommendation is no change, that's your report.
Correct. So I don't know if there's a way to memorialize that language in here that we will make a
Sure.
report, whether it contains comments or not,
Correct.
so that
Yep.
we're covered and zoning has a piece of paper in their hand.
That's how it
Okay.
should work.
Okay.
There should not be a special exception heard unless there is some form, whether it's favorable, no comments, or not. There should be a letter from the planning commission that the zoning hearing board sees.
I agree. Thank you.
I have just one thing to ask. It would probably be more for some, like, if somebody comes to you and says, I have this special exception, what's my, and I have to have it to you 30 days prior to the meeting? For a normal procedure. So my submission
35.
date's 30 days prior to the zoning meeting.
35.
Yes, yeah, the cutoff date is 35 days. That gives me 1 week for review and then legal
Time to
advertisement.
advertise. So I knew I had 30 days once I submitted. What is now my time frame till I'm in front of a zoning hearing board?
If you submit a zone, well, a lot of times we discuss it prior to. We give everybody the dates prior to when they come in. But if you submit an application and I say, this is the next date that we need to go to the planning commission for the advisory report, and I don't have the 60 days to cover for the zoning hearing board, I immediately would have a time waiver signed by the applicant to make sure, because we have to hear at zoning hearing board within 60 days. But we have to make sure it gets to the planning commission first so it can be heard at the zoning hearing board.
So what would normally be a 30-day process could throw someone into a 3-month process.
I don't know.
If I just missed the planning commission, like I'm 2 days after this commission meeting, I come in and now I don't realize that, oh, now I gotta wait.
It's possible.
So it could be 30 days
It's
for
possible, but
that.
everyone's really going to be going by the zoning hearing board date. They're not going to be going by the planning commission date because their goal is to go to the zoning hearing board. And then that's when I say, okay, you need to go to the planning commission. And so I'd have to actually look at our schedules now and then see exactly how that would work out, if that has that potential. But that's usually how it works. It could be 1 month, you go to the planning commission, the next month you go. So it could extend it by a month, yes.
Okay.
It also has potential to streamline things because sometimes you go to a zoning hearing board meeting and then they say, oh, we want input from the planning commission. Then you're going back and forth. So to have this linear path prescribed, it could help eliminate some of the back and forth.
I think it's very beneficial for the township as a whole to have all departments in on these land development plans.
Yeah, I found it very interesting that, and I think Joe pointed this out. The special exception and the conditional use are basically the same process, just to 2 different boards. And interestingly enough, in our zoning ordinance, the conditional use is spelled out very specifically. I mean, it names the planning commission as the initial entry point for the conditional use. I mean, it basically runs through the whole process. But you turn over to the special exception regulations, and there is no similar thing in that. It is simply the zoning hearing board needs to look at these general criteria, and that's it. So we found that to be, once that was pointed out, that's a very interesting thing, that you have two almost exactly same processes, one spelled out very clearly and one is very loosely spelled out. And unfortunately, it's a special exception that is very loosely spelled out. So we're trying to bring those two processes more into consistency.
Greg is absolutely right, and I think Laura summarized it well when she said South Whitehall is unique in that the review by the Planning Commission does not presently exist for a special exception, because you find that in most municipalities.
Okay.
I just have a quick wording note, top of page 85, after the 45.
Yes.
And you already said about the relabeling.
Yep.
I think in general it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And then we'll add clarity on if the Planning Commission has no comments in the report, and add clarity as to if there's the recommendation to send professional staff, that the BOC gets its chance to actually make that decision before the zoning hearing board receives the advisory report.
Is it possible to be as specific as, planning's typically on a Thursday, it would be the next Board of Commissioners meeting, so that we make sure there's no time lapse between planning making their recommendation and getting as quickly to BOC so that they can let appropriate staff know to prepare, because the zoning hearing could be within 30 days or so, correct?
Yeah, typically after Planning Commission, it's either 2 or 3 weeks till the next Board of Commissioner meeting, based on the calendar.
So you wouldn't want to miss that next BOC meeting and end up at the second one because you'd run out.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily have to be in the ordinance at all. It could be by procedure established by the Planning Commission. But this advisory report, the question comes up in my mind, well, who is going to write it? Who is going to sign it? It could be something that perhaps is written by staff based on the results of the Planning Commission meeting, and whether it be the Planning Commission chair that signs it, whether it be staff member that signs it, you can decide all that, but you probably want to send it up in a way that it does not need to come back to the Planning Commission at the next meeting for a vote on the report itself, because that would add the extra month that Mark had expressed the concern about.
Right. In my past, it has been done where it was the planning secretary from the meeting minutes wrote up the advisory report, the chairman or designated person came in, reviewed it, signed it, and then independently they came in, not through another board meeting, and then we attached it and moved it forward.
And does the report become part of the meeting minutes?
Yes, it
from
does.
the plan review date? Okay.
It'll get entered into the record with the stenographer during the hearing.
But I'm saying on the planning side of it, will it be part of the Planning Commission meeting minutes that?
It should be if it, yes.
Well, actually, the comments are generally
So
part of the minutes, because that's what minutes are.
But would you reference, this is the advisory report that was sent, so that there's a complete record from the Planning Commission sending?
How it would go. If you're discussing the advisory report at the Planning Commission, those would all be entered into as meeting minutes.
Not generally.
not necessarily the report,
Yeah.
but I
No, because
guess,
the report's not generated yet,
right.
but it's the discussion of it.
No, because
But I maybe, and we'll have to kind of hash through this, but because you're approving the minutes later, as part of the approving the minutes, we have the advisory report included in that.
good.
Seems like some of the timing aspects.
Yeah, I look
hashed
at
out.
I look at this as, for example, let's go back to conditional use, which you guys are pretty familiar with. Some of you have been through a number of them with this board. The report that comes out of there is much like what we call the Planning Commission action report. This is something that details what was approved at the meeting by vote, and then sent on to the applicant. This was exactly what happened both with Bizzotti and Ridge Farm, where that then went to the Board of Commissioners as is. Staff wrote it. No one actually signed it. It was simply something that we generated, a simple report that staff generated from the results of the meeting. And then that was included in the materials for conditional use at the BOC meeting. and that was entered into the record for BOC. So that actually got in that way. So I'm kind of wondering if we're generating something here that would be kind of unique in including it in the minutes when nothing else we do is similar to that.
And I think the issue, and I think this might be where Diane's heading, is that we don't have that in the public record other than in the zoning packet and as part of the hearing, but whether we should put it in as a item on our website as, this advisory report was generated at this meeting.
But that's not quite the case, because if you look at our current minutes now, when we make recommendations on plans, that is actually included in the minutes. It's simply taking all of the conditions of approval, the recommendation, and that's in the minutes. So I have no problem taking what is essentially the meat of the advisory report, dropping it into the meeting minutes, and you then approve it.
Whatever is ultimately decided as to the protocol, I would recommend, since the intent is for the process for conditional use and special exception to essentially mirror each other, do it the same way for both. And that may mean you have a recommendation on how to change it for special exception, or you do change it for conditional use, or you may want to keep it the way it is. But whatever you ultimately think is the best way, do it the same for both.
And I'll have to admit, one of the things after looking at this, the conditional use review process is, I think, a little obsolete right now in the zoning ordinance. We do follow it, but we don't follow it to the letter. We follow it in as much as what our process is. So as we move forward with the comp plan and then to revamp the zoning ordinance, I've already put a marker in my head that we should update the rules for both conditional use and special exception, make them identical at the same time.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and hopefully I'm not rehashing things, but my question is, we have the planning commission meeting, we provide our input, and then that advisory report gets generated. It seems there's some questions and that it gets generated. Does everyone get to see it, after it gets generated, or does it just get passed along?
It would, if we're doing it in the same process, it would look much like the minutes. Something here that's similar. Unfortunately, the minutes don't have anything in them where you made a recommendation. Now, normally speaking, when you get into the minutes where a recommendation was made, what you will see is so-and-so made a recommendation, a second, and the recommendation was to, for example, recommend approval of the Board of Commissioners with the following conditions. And then the list of conditions is included in the minutes. And at the end, it is basically like someone made the motion, someone seconded, and the motion was approved by that vote. So I'm thinking that's kind of what you would see.
Right, but I think Joe's point and my concern was this doesn't have to get okayed before it goes to zoning. That adds a whole nother month to the process.
Right.
Our advisory report goes right to zoning.
When you say this doesn't have to get okayed, what are you referring to this?
Our
The
advisory
minutes?
report.
Well, see, we need the advisory report before going to the zoning
Yeah, but
hearing
what
board.
he's saying is you approve it at the planning commission meeting. We go through it, we go through all the comments, all the questions, I write them down.
Yes.
You approve them. They're immediately released to the zoning hearing board once drafted, or to the Board of Commissioners if a recommendation is meant to send something else. They are then included in the minutes. So the approval of the minutes is simply the approval of the minutes. It's not the approval of the advisory report.
Correct.
Because otherwise we'd be waiting another month to approve the advisory report, which in theory was already approved at the prior planning commission meeting. You know what I'm saying?
So the advisory report is basically everything that's discussed at the planning commission meeting.
Yeah, when somebody makes a motion, they detail what the motion is.
If we have 5 specific criteria, we want the zoning hearing board to examine hours of operation, parking requirements, traffic, then we'll tell Greg, our advisory report will say we have these 5 things and that we believe that they should look into and maybe make it the condition upon their approval. That's what you're going to run with. And that's just going to be part of our minutes later.
Yeah, exactly. And somebody makes the motion. When you make the motion, you have to detail what exactly that motion is. So everyone will understand what they're voting on with that motion. And that motion becomes the advisory report. Yes.
Write the report at the meeting.
Yes, exactly. And then you get to review it in the minutes at the following meeting.
But it gets moved, it potentially will get moved on to the zoning hearing board
Immediately
prior
follow
to
the
the
first
minutes being approved.
Exactly.
And whether we have that signed by the chairman or vice chair or something that.
Or even if it has to be signed.
Right. And that's something we can talk about. But I think that, so it's really that motion is the advisory report.
Mm-hmm. Because for all land developments, that motion becomes the basis of the approving resolution that is then placed before the Board of Commissioners generally at their next meeting.
All right,
I
so
don't see why it's not something you could sign, Township planner.
I could. I mean, in theory, you've heard what the motion is. You voted on the motion. I'm just merely writing it on paper.
Not like you miss a lot of meetings.
Not right now. I mean, we'll talk it around. We'll make the revisions, bring it back
visit
at a
revisit it
future
next.
meeting.
All right. Agenda item 6C, zoning ordinance service pack 2C.
Okay. Okay, this is our.
17 minutes.
No. No. We're going to get this one done tonight. Let me get there. All right, so basically, you've seen this. This is the third view of this. We plowed through most of it. Starting on page 87, that's the Service Pack 2C. You'll note on page 88 and 89, this is the table of contents. So we've already been through typos, broken references, and obvious inconsistencies. You've passed those along. We did have 5 sections that there were some changes done, mainly from your comments, in staff suggested repairs to improve the functionality of the zoning ordinance. So if we can go to page number 45 at the bottom of the pages. So from here on out, I will note the bottom page number, not the upper right page number, for clarity. So let's start with page 45, which is amending section 350-42B, screening requirements, to clarify and increase options for buffer strips and clarify when buffer strips are required. So the changes are on pages 46 and 47. This is in response to your request to have berms included as an option. So we looked at this as part of staff, and the highlighted items in yellow are the changes made. So we are adding an additional subsection into this standard screening. Berm and evergreen plantings, berm and vegetation comprising the screening shall present a solid screen of at least 6 feet in height when viewed from the adjoining property and shall consist of the berm at least 3 feet above original grade, stabilized with grass, and evergreen plantings, which are on the outward facing toward the adjoining property slope, and spaced no more than 4 feet apart on center and minimum height of 3 feet above adjacent grade at root flare. So does anyone have any comments? Do you want to change any of those numbers?
Original grade,
Original grade.
shouldn't we be looking
Proposed
at,
grade.
shouldn't we be looking
proposed
at
finish.
existing or proposed? 'Cause I mean, cut and fill site,
It should be 3 feet above proposed grade.
Proposed grade, okay. Okay, make that change.
Could we talk about minimum side slope?
Excuse me.
Well, normally you would at least have not too.
Tony, do you have any comment on slope?
Like not
I
to,
think that the ordinance itself already references a maximum slope of 3 to 1, not specific to a berm or anything else. So I think that if you maintain that, you can maintain a 3 to 1 slope. If you want to put something else in, you can change it. Obviously, you should use the side slope, top width, and height of the berm in a manner that's consistent with the width of a buffer. So you don't want to say that the buffer is only 10 foot tall, but you want 4 to 1 slopes and an 8 foot tall berm because it just won't fit. So I think that as you talk about that, it would be nice that both of those work hand in hand. So 25 feet, you're only going 3 feet tall. You can go 4 to 1 side slopes, on each side that's 12 feet, probably 5 foot width. It'll fit in there. So something like that, I think that should work hand in hand so that it makes sense. 2 to 1 seems steep for stabilization and grass growth. 3 to 1.
You want to say the design of which is acceptable to the township engineer and make it that simple?
I only ask because I've just in practice, 3 to 1 was the norm, but proved, through like global stability or something that you could go deeper. Like I don't have a preference personally. I just asking the question, should we at least have that note in there? It aligns, must align.
I would recommend against leaving it to the discretion of the township engineer in the ordinance. Because zoning really should be something you could look at the book and know whether you comply or not. And that would be too subjective, too discretionary to do that. One thing you might consider is don't put the side slope requirement in the zoning ordinance, but put it in saldo. And then the applicant can make the pitch and ultimately the Board of Commissioners decides whether to go for it. But if you put it in the zoning, you're not talking about the zoning hearing board for any kind of variance, any kind of waiver.
Side slopes are already regulated in, is it in the Saldo?
I believe it's in the Saldos. I think just grading itself's in the Saldos 3 to 1. And I agree that if you leave it subjective, I would suspect our office would get many questions about how it's to be designed prior to even getting an application escrow, but before the project comes to fruition, because it's how much room do I need so that I could design my site? So I would rather put something generic in there. And as Joe said, if it's saldo, then they could try and argue a waiver if they want to do take a site that wants to do a 3 to 1 front facing side slopes up against the neighbors, but they want to put a vertical wall on the backside. So that would be a waiver, but that would give planning commission and then the board the opportunity to weigh in if that's an acceptable modification or not.
In accordance
say
with
Saldo
Saldo and township engineer.
In accordance with Saldo?
I don't know that I would say in the zoning ordinance it should be in accordance with saldo, because one could then argue that you also need a variance in order to get a saldo waiver.
Right.
So I would just be silent on it and let saldo take over.
Yeah, because for the most part, Saldo would be part of this. I'm having a hard time trying to figure out a berm that would be put in place outside of land development. Because land development is basically an improvement of a non-residential property in some way, shape, or form. So if you're improving a non-residential property, and generally non-residential buffering requirements are not required typically of residential properties. So they're typically required of non-residential properties. So you're looking at an improvement, which then would spur land development, which would then spur a SALDO review. So I think silent is probably a decent way of handling it. Okay. Right. The only other thing in that is if you look at the top of page 40, toward the top of page 47, there is a highlighted area. It says, you see a strikeout of, however, motor vehicle sales facilities shall be permitted a display area free of buffer strip between the display area and the public street. I think that's a holdover from regulation when it wasn't quite clear that buffer areas are not permitted along a public street. So we're making it clear that they're not permitted along a public street. Therefore, that is a superfluous section. So we're going to remove that. And of course, page 48 then shows the final product with the changes. So I will add to that, remove original in subsection 3A1 and replace it with proposed. I think that's the only comment there. Okay, very good. If there are no other comments, we'll move on to page 57. And this is temporary uses by right. And for the most part, I think everyone was happy with that. I do want to point out, I'm not quite sure if everyone caught this the last time. Okay. The changes on page 59 that are listed. This is with the fee being waived. Actually, I think that's fine. It was the following page, page 60. I believe you passed this along. I don't recall any discussion to this item, but this is where we're talking about clinics, which currently the language is clinics coordinated by public health officials for administrating mass vaccinations, blood drives, and similar clinics planned by public health officials to meet a regional health need. During COVID, we found out that we had a number of people who wanted to set up vaccination sites. However, it was done not by public health officials. So we essentially had to deny those requests. So we felt that in certain situations like that, people who are simply going out and administering vaccinations need not be directed by health officials in those situations. So we've decided to actually remove the coordinated by health officials and planned by health officials. This gives a little more flexibility to those people who want to set up vaccinations who aren't public health officials, but rather private entities, private healthcare providers doing that sort of work.
Meaning doctors, or I mean, what type
Lehigh Valley Health Network,
they're not considered
St.
a public,
Luke's.
Yeah.
would they not be considered a public health official or hospital?
An official implies elected or appointed, governmental.
CDC.
Yeah. Or the county health advisory board, or something along those lines.
Even mass testing sites could have been done by
anyone.
didn't care that happened to happen that day, and you had 10 cars waiting in line to get there.
Exactly.
They were doing it in the car, in the parking lot.
Yep, exactly.
Lots, so I
Yeah,
hope they
there were a
let
lot
her
of
do it.
those, a lot of major drugstore chains were doing that sort of thing, taking their pharmacists and doing it on site. So that's.
Can there be text like a health professional, medical professional?
Sure. We can
I agree.
change.
I think because it's silent,
Yeah.
I mean,
Anyone can do it.
Definitely don't want to be
well,
out
I
there
mean,
and
you would
get
hope not, but
Yeah.
it's,
Sure, we can simply change coordinated by public health officials to coordinated by public health professionals. Okay, that's easy enough.
So a clinic by a public health official does not need a permit. They just go out and they don't notify the township. They just go out and have a clinic.
No, under this section, this was the one we were changing to, you need a permit, but the permit fee is waived.
Great. Okay.
So we will be tracking this sort of stuff.
Okay. That was my question.
Yeah,
To have
absolutely,
An
yeah.
emergency plan and for the township to be aware.
Yep,
There's
to be aware.
questions.
Because currently, we don't have to be aware. They can simply set these up without telling us. So this allows us to be informed, but not charge them a fee for it.
And at the bottom of page 59, that last paragraph, it says the application fee shall be considered to be waived by the Board of Commissioners. How is that process going to proceed? Will they actually need to come to a public meeting to have a waiver?
No, this is basically saying that if they meet these standards, the Board of Commissioners is granting the zoning ordinance the ability to waive the fee under these standards. And if they don't meet the standards, the zoning officer will call that in her review and require the fee to be tendered. So it would then be treated just like a normal zoning permit.
And halfway up the page is a paragraph about signs, paragraph 4.
Mm-hmm.
Temporary signs shall not exceed 8 feet in height. Is that currently what
That's the current, that's the current
an 8-foot
regulation.
sign could be constructed for a temporary?
For temporary use signage, yes.
But the sign face shall be limited to 32 square feet.
32
Yeah.
square.
It could be 8 foot to get over a hedgerow or a fence, but.
Yeah. Yeah, that's our current language, and I believe has been there for a while like that.
Okay.
That's a question.
Well, 8 feet high, the 8 feet in height is the measurement of the literal sign, not represented to the height of it off the ground.
Temporary sign shall not exceed 8 feet in height. So above grade, no part of that sign can go more than 8 feet above grade.
From the ground to the top of the sign.
Yep, exactly.
Sign itself.
Yeah.
Yes, but the way it reads is a temporary sign shall not exceed 8 feet in height. Height by,
And height is measured from grade. That's the definition of height
is that?
in the
okay.
zoning ordinance, yes.
And
Thank
how
you.
long is that sign allowed to be displayed?
Well, we do have another ordinance amendment about temporary signage in here. And I believe what we did was we made it for the length of the temporary use. And I think that's one of the things we'll be looking at in page 76, which is actually now up next. Yep, there it is. So the changes in this one.
I'm sorry, Brian typed something in the chat, but it was 6 minutes ago, so we may have covered it. And his question is, how do we know they're legit vaccinations? And I think that's where we're.
Public health professionals.
Public health professionals. Yep. Sorry, Brian, I missed it.
I had a similar question. Would it make sense to say licensed clinics, or like, do they have to show proof of some type of legal authority to administer them?
We could.
I think
that would be prudent.
Okay.
What about if you just have a doctor going to a church?
He's a licensed doctor.
The doctor would be,
Doctor,
in that case,
facility,
licensed.
not a licensed facility.
License or some sort of.
I think the administration of if it's the vaccine, is done by a licensed professional, is what we're looking at.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's not Although,
Is clinics
some of my
defined? Do you need
vaccine-
to refer to clinics? I'm thinking about my vaccine was at Dorney Park, run by the hospital, well-run, thousands and thousands of people going through there. I don't know if that was a clinic, though.
Yeah. I mean, I got it at Rite Aid
Well,
by the,
That's not a temporary event, then that's just going into a
oh, well, that's true.
store.
yeah. Clinics for administering mass vaccinations, blood drives, or similar clinics to meet a regional health need.
But that's what I do think, Dorney Park. I mean, they often hold clinics in their parking lot
Yeah.
to administer.
You'd call that a clinic?
Yeah,
But if
yeah,
this is
I
a,
think that would be understood.
if this is a permitted event,
Yes.
can't you, within the permit application, qualify the act and have that substantiate anything that you want?
Yeah, it's a zoning permit, so we can, if we do cover it, we can condition the approval of the permit by something along those
Some
lines.
form of documentation that
Yeah.
proves.
And if there's any ambiguity, it's up to the zoning officer to make that call. And if the applicant doesn't like it, they appeal to the zoning hearing board.
Yep, exactly.
Brian had something in the chat. Do you want to just go ahead and speak, Brian?
I was trying to avoid speaking, but right off the Lehigh Valley Health Network's website, it basically says Lehigh Valley Health Network, or LVHN, flu shot clinics, and it has Dorney Park listed, so they consider it a clinic.
Mhm. Yeah, and certainly a temporary event, we've been considering those to be clinics. So you don't have to be in an official building.
And I have a question. I know the township has moved to have emergency operating plans for large events of a certain number of expected attendees. Is that something that we would include in the zoning permits, that they would also comply with the township's emergency? For example, Dorney Park, I mean, they draw thousands of people when they have that event. So for the township to be prepared for police and public works and whatever emergency service responders we might need there, is that something we bring in now, or is there another branch where, for example, LVHN comes to the township for a permit? How do we inform them that they also need to make sure they've got an emergency plan in place?
I think that was something that the zoning officer could address at the approval stage. I mean, there's
Or at least direct to township.
Yeah, direct them
appropriate
to do
staff
that,
to
yes.
make sure
Yeah,
that the
and
event is covered from
We
that
always,
perspective.
we also have the special event permit, which talks about road closures and traffic control and things like that. So I think if the zoning officer determines that it rises to that level, then we can trigger that
Okay.
piece.
Good. Yep.
Just trigger that process.
And I think for the most part, LVHN does contact us and make those arrangements. But once again, we have no permit requirement for any of that now. So in theory, they could just fly under the radar and set one of these up. So at least we now have a permit to direct them to do that.
Makes sense.
Brian's got a comment.
So I volunteer for emergency response across the counties, and is there a way, or would this prevent, let's say Limerick nuclear power plant had a problem, and we're in the evacuation zone for Limerick, and to, administer iodine and stuff like that, they're not going to have time to get a permit, but is that something we would be able to allow them to have?
I would think
I just
under
don't want,
emergency circumstances,
yeah.
the application of a permit could be expedited.
Right.
That would
Well, I'm
probably
just trying to avoid the conspiracies. Oh, they're trying to give us this. They don't even have a permit. There's a lot of weirdness going on out there.
I would think that would be tied to the township declaring a state of emergency, and then that relaxes a lot of the requirements on the township, and we're allowed to move forward very quickly to respond to emergencies.
Yeah.
Is that my understanding?
If it's true emergency, yeah, we can suspend a number of regulations, I believe.
And, I mean, based on some of our prior conversations about zoning pack 2C,
Mhm.
these are amendments to the zoning that they are requirements of the community. However, in practice, they provide the opportunity for zoning to enforce if there are issues, complaints,
Yes.
or problems.
Yes. Mhm.
The more often, I mean, there may be, there may likely be people that aren't aware, but if not creating an issue or a hindrance to their surrounding neighbors or community, it will continue on. But if there are issues or activities that create a problem, by these amendments, zoning has the ability to enforce and restrict for the betterment of the community overall.
Exactly. That was the idea behind these, because currently what's listed there is permitted by right without a permit. So we're not even informed much of the time. Where were we? I think we were
76.
76. Yes, this is temporary event signage. The changes, you had seen some of these before, had no issues. The changes are on page 78. And I think this was a Jennifer Aldifer statement. She said, what if you adopt the prior one of temporary use? You might have to change the wording on this slightly. So I'm just pointing this out. If you do adopt number 6, which is temporary uses by right, which we've just discussed, then the temporary event signs would have to be changed to say, as listed in 35046A1A, temporary uses permitted by right requiring a permit with fee waived, to reflect the adoption of the prior amendment. So that's all it is. That would not be needed if you choose not to adopt the earlier amendment. Questions? Okay, moving on to page 79. Ugh, flags. And I have to say that the LVPC will be very happy with this. Because every other amendment that we've mentioned, signs, they've said, hey, you need to change this. Flags. Because we only specify 3 flags. And I think there are many more out there than what are there. So basically, you had seen this previously. You had agreed that we should change that to allow pretty much any flag to be flown. But we did talk about, in staff, a flagpole that is attached to a building. And currently, it states, in the event the flagpole is attached to a building, currently, such flagpole shall not extend above the sign height line of such building. That's where it ends. I believe the sign height line is only 2 feet above the roof line. So if anybody wants to put a flag on top of a building, it can only be 2 feet higher than the roof line, which that kind of makes no sense, because then you're only flying a flag that's about this big.
Well, I think it's for like a wall mounted, can project out at an angle 2 feet above. But if you wanted to put a vertical on the roof, it would only have to be 2 feet high.
Yeah. So basically, we decided to remove that sign height line portion and simply state that such flagpole shall adhere to this section with regard to setbacks to property lines and to section 350.42.8 height exceptions with regard to height. Therefore, you place the flag on the building. The setback is the height of the flag measured from grade to the top of the flagpole. Therefore, it has to be set back from the property line at least that distance. So if the flag falls, if the pole falls, it will fall on this property, not an adjoining property. And section 350.42H height exceptions, although troubled, is something we're not looking at this time. which basically allows either 40% above the roof line or 140% above the roof line, depending upon your interpretation. So we will leave that in place. So that's what we're doing there. So if somebody wants to put a flagpole on a roof, these are the new standards they must meet, which will allow them to actually put a flagpole on a roof.
Something I'll just mention that occurs to me as I look at this, and whatever you think is appropriate is certainly fine with me, but I think everybody's probably familiar with my office next door. And next to the Eagle, I have a flagpole. I am confident that my flagpole would not comply with this ordinance provision because the height of it, if it fell, and of course they don't really topple at the base, but if that were to happen, there's no doubt it would extend over the sidewalk and maybe even into the curb in the street. And I don't personally think my flagpole's a danger or that it's in an inappropriate location, but if you do, that's fine, but that would be the impact of this ordinance provision.
Yeah, if you think about banks and stuff or any business, flagpole, if it falls, could end up in the parking lot or over the walkway.
Into the street is the main concern.
But nonetheless, creating a safety hazard regardless.
Indeed. And I do want to point out that the current regulation does say that shall be set back a distance equal to its height from all lot lines. I'm just saying. So yours would obviously be grandfathered in. So
Brian has a comment.
Uh-oh.
So I'm piggybacking on Mr. Zader's comment about his flagpole. I'm thinking about the school district flagpoles and how they could potentially be in driveways and sidewalks and how that would be handled. But if they're grandfathered,
Yeah, it would be pre-existing non-conforming, and then, we're looking at property lines, not necessarily sidewalks and driveways.
But if this is adopted and a resident were to complain about their neighbor's flagpole, would this apply to them?
If it's been there, it's a lawful.
If they can prove that it was there prior.
Prior to it.
Pre-existing nonconformity. Yep. Or grandfathered, the more colloquial term. So, any questions to this section? Okay. Shall we move on to the next one? Page 80. These are the general sign regulations again. Once again, the highlighted section on bottom page 80, top of page 81. I believe this is, once again, addressing Jennifer Alderfer's comment of what if you adopt the prior ordinance, you have to change the reference in that section. So that's what this does. In conjunction with temporary use is permitted by right, requiring a permit with fee waived. Any questions there?
I'm just curious, opening of a new establishment, so you can have 7 days to have a flag or streamers or balloons. So these don't require a permit, correct?
Well, if you adopt the prior amendment, they will require a permit, but fee waived.
And then the township will have a vehicle or mechanism to follow up.
Enforce, yeah.
Enforce if the signs aren't taken down.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, we'll have a start date and an end date. So that'd be good. Any other questions? All right, now we're moving into the next and last section. You had seen number 1 on page 83 and had no comments on. Number 2, in section 35042A, accessory uses and structures. 35048G1, garage carport private, and section 35048S17, storage building shed, to clarify setbacks and proportionality. This is the one where we're all fine until Dave said, what about barns? So we went back, took a look at it, and change the items that are highlighted in yellow. So we added accessible by a driveway and to garages. I think Dave caught that one. Is a garage if you can't get to it by a driveway? So we wanted to make sure that, yes, a garage is a garage for parking cars, but you need to have a driveway attached to it. Otherwise, it's a shed or storage building. For the additional regulations, currently they are only two subsections. One is for non-residential accessory storage buildings. The other one is for residential accessory storage buildings. So what we did was we broke that up into three sections, citing agricultural uses, which then references 350-48F2 farm outbuildings, which is basically stating that there's really not much in the way of regulation to farm outbuildings. I think they have setbacks, but that's about it. And then plugging in the remainder of them, commercial, industrial, and institutional uses, I believe is exactly the same as we have now. Storage building for residential uses, we do break that apart. So you have size, and I believe an additional section in there, which means larger pole building type things in residentials have to adhere to the side and rear yard setback of the primary use. Currently, a shed only needs a 4-foot side yard and rear yard setback. But if you're having, something over 500 square feet, which is, a 10 by 50 or a 25 by 20, then in order to disperse any stormwater or something along those lines, we felt that it should more apply to the setbacks of the main residential dwelling. So any questions related to that one? Okay. Number 3, we talked about horses. So there was some question as to the appropriate regulatory agency that would regulate a nutrient management plan. So we added that part in, once again highlighted in yellow. But then somebody brought up about horses. What is a horse? So we became specific. It's a domesticated equidae, which includes donkeys, mules, and ponies. So if somebody wants to have ponies, now we can allow them to have ponies.
We were struggling whether a pony counts as half a horse for the ordinance.
But I would suppose for the nutrient management plan where weight is involved, it may actually count as half a horse. So there you go. So those are the highlights are the changes. We did add the two other sections for setbacks because they have slightly different setbacks. So we wanted to make sure the zoning officer caught those. So any questions on that one? All right, let's move to the gorilla in the room.
Yep.
Elephant in the room. Page 88, this is amend section 350-44C to correct impervious lot coverage for a residential use. We had talked about this 2 meetings ago, where basically, if you turn to page, where is it, 90, unmarked page 94, you'll see a lovely chart. This is a line graph. The top line graph is the full spectrum of it. It goes along the y-axis, left to right, up to 450,000 square feet of lot. The x-axis is your maximum impervious square footage allowed. The big jagged black line is what the current ordinance allows. So you'll notice that it goes up, then drops down, goes up and drops down, goes up and drops down, and that's all because we put percentages at a specific level of square footage of lot. So the effort was to smooth these things out. And last meeting, we talked about the number of options we have there. The first one is basically simply remove it. The second one is to change it to smooth that line out, make it less jagged, and generally increase the maximum lot coverage as sizes increase. One after that is to smooth it and approximate the general lines that we have now. The one after that is to smooth it and reduce it slightly. And then Tony brought up the issue of, the complicated issue of lot grading plans, stormwater runoff, stormwater management in large residential subdivisions, and the like. So if you read the highlighted section on page 92, I think that gives a synopsis of what we're trying to do on a broader scale with the next option. So we're trying to smooth the line, obviously. But what we're looking to do is tie this in to the stormwater management and saldo in the future, in the hopes that we can require a developer to design their stormwater management, specifically for residential developments, to meet the maximum impervious surface coverage for their lots. And what that will do, it's an issue that we've been seeing more and more lately of when a developer comes in with a residential plan. There's nothing requiring them, giving them a requirement to how large they design their stormwater management systems. So for example, Ridge Farm. There's no standards for which all those basins were designed or sized. It was simply the developer saying, well, we want to size it for something what we think is reasonable in streets, sidewalks, parking areas, and perhaps residential building envelopes. But there's no standard, so they can decide to build, the building envelopes are very small or very large. It's up to them. What we've been finding, for example, in a number of these developments is that when the developer designs their stormwater management systems on the small side, many, if not all of the lots then are coming in with a homeowner building a larger house on it than the impervious surface that's already permitted by the designed stormwater systems. So what they have to do then is on lot manage that additional impervious surface and the stormwater running off of that. And we've seen some, 4 modifications to the NPDES permit on one lot so far. It gets to be problematic because then they're building additional BMPs on their own lot to deal with their own stormwater. Whereas if the lot had been built, had been designed with a reasonable amount of impervious surface on that, that stormwater would already be accounted for in the development's stormwater management system. So you wouldn't have to have these additional BMPs placed on the lots. And the problem is that we're finding is, of course, most people don't understand what these things are. They don't realize when they're buying the home, they're buying additional BMPs that they are then required to ensure work and function, periodically get engineers to come in to ensure that they're functioning correctly at added expense. This is something that most homeowners just don't understand and aren't prepared to deal with.
And, shoot you for it.
Laura.
Just real quick. So the other piece of it is we have to then keep track of impervious coverage where we can't rely on, what's the impervious coverage by zone or lot size. It becomes what was the approved impervious coverage. So it makes tracking a heck of a lot more difficult for us. Where if the developer came in and designed at the max, then we know that it's covered and we don't have to worry about it.
Yes, and right now, a lot of these larger developments have HOAs that then take care of the stormwater management systems, but only the ones dedicated to the HOAs, generally not the ones on the individual lots. So we are required to get confirmation every so often, engineered confirmation that these stormwater management systems are working. So we will get one from the HOA, but then we have to get one from every property owner in there that has a BMP on their lot. Whereas if they are designed to the max, then in theory, I would say 95 to 99% of the BMPs out there would instead be managed by the HOA, which means the HOA then can hire every 3 years an engineer to come in and verify all of them at one time, which is cheaper for the individuals living in the HOA because they're hiring one engineer. They'll generally get a cheaper rate due to quantity, and thus everybody's piece of that is much smaller, rather than everybody hiring their own engineer to look at their own BMPs. So it becomes this thing of the township benefits and the individual residential property owners tend to benefit from this thing. The only problem is that then you're now throwing the onus more on the developer because he's got to generally design larger systems, which tends to reduce your densities, your yield in the development, and is probably a little more expensive because they actually have to design larger basins, larger stormwater systems to deal with all of the stormwater that could be coming in. So that's kind of the trade-off. You improve things for the township, you improve things for the individual residences, but the developer has the added burden. So that's the end result. But right now, we're just asking you to change the zoning ordinance so that in the future, if we decide to go this way, we have the option. We have something in place that we have considered if and when we go that way. So the staff recommendation at this point is what's on page 93, which lays out the chart for 0 square feet to 5,000 square feet of lot. If you have a 4,850 square foot lot, that would fall under that. You get 80% of your lot as maximum impervious coverage. The current is 100, by the way, so we're reducing that down. And then once you move upward in scale, it goes like a tax bracket. So your first 5,000 feet is measured this way. The next set is measured a different way. So there is no jagged ups and downs to this. It's a smooth line. And if you move to the next page on the line graph, you can see the result of that. This is generally the darkest line at the lower end of the graph. So it's a nice smooth line. You do get the initial uptick to account for the smaller lots having larger percentages. And then as the lots get larger, progressively larger, the increase gets progressively smaller. If you look at the dots, you will see dots on there. Those dots are actual lots in the township. I went out and reviewed 3 different subdivisions and plotted on the graph what their actual what their actual impervious surface is now. And you will see that with the exception of 2 dots, all of those dots are under that line. The lower table is an excerpt. That only goes up to 10,000 square foot lot size. It's actually blowing up the very small end of the top table because there's a whole bunch of dots there, but you really can't see it in the top table. So I blew that up so you can see the dots better in the bottom table. So there's only 1 dot there at about 3,000 square foot lot size that exceeds what you would have. And I believe that's, what was that? Yeah, up here on the top table. I'll get to that one. This one, I believe, is the one that has the 4 minor mods to the NPDES permit.
I'd like to make clarification
Mhm.
because I think you're lumping. Does this chart speak to the developer maximizing the lot for the most stormwater.
No,
No, they're two separate things.
they are two separate things.
Exactly.
Yes.
So that needs to be clarified, that this chart does not have anything to do with the BMPs and the maximizing the
Well,
lots.
I said it doesn't, it's a separate issue, but it was built with that in mind. So if we do move forward, this chart is already
It's also a
built.
snowball effect. So when they come into the land development stage and they propose these houses that show this little square and they say they're going to be 2,000 square lots and they get their NEPI's permits, there's so much square footage allowed that lot. Then when they start to build and the main house is done and the developer or the builder walks away, then that's when the homeowner wants to start adding their what we call secondary permits. So you're getting your in-ground pools or your above-ground pools and your sheds and your extra patios and all this stuff. That's what starts throwing it into the minor mod where they have to go, as long as this NEPI's permit is still open under the developer, they have to go for the minor mod to show the increase in how they're going to manage the stormwater on their property. And then if additional BMPs, which is the best management practices, come into play, and they have to throw more rain gardens or swales or underground, the pits, whatever has to happen, that all gets done during that time. And then the developer is going to have to maintain all that before signing off of the NEPI's permit, which is where then the HOA and who's going to maintain these, because the township has to get the requirements from an engineer that all these BMPs are working every 3 years. So when the owners buy this and the builder or developer does not make the buyer aware of this, then you get some of these conflicts. But that doesn't really address the issue of how we're going to manage these, which is why we have to keep track of this when the secondary permits come in. So the HOAs, when you brought up that point as well, is another aspect in which it could be looked at where the HOAs can maintain these so that not each individual person is maintaining them on their lot. But in some cases, you don't have that. Like on the other side with the Jandal lot, there's not going to be an HOA there.
And,
So,
and all of this is kind of separate from this
Right.
conversation for impervious coverage
yeah, this
tonight.
is completely,
But
yeah.
again, that's all some of the issues that we're running into. And this, clarifying this piece of it is the first step for us to get to addressing these larger issues. So I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole because it's the big one. But if we can kind of step back and just look at this impervious coverage by lot size, it's going to help us clarify that piece of it so that we can address a lot of these other issues that we're having as staff and with a lot of our residents.
Right. And then what's going to help with this section with this chart on 179 is that's when we're going to try and also implement something in the future, the individual lot grading plans for secondary structures and so forth. But this is the first step in getting this addressed before because this is also going to help with impervious coverage and the maximizing of it on a lot.
How does this match up with the township's Act 167 thresholds?
The proposed one?
No, this proposed zoning ordinance, how does it match up with our existing?
The stormwater?
Yeah, with our.
We have a separate stormwater ordinance.
Right, I know, that's what I'm asking. How does it match up with that?
I did not compare this one, but there are some conflicts already that when Mike, Elias, and I go out and we have the water issues, we're having conflicts.
And Tony's got his hand up.
Yeah.
So your stormwater management ordinance doesn't do anything to preclude the amount of impervious outside of zoning. So right now, if you're allowed 65% per zoning, stormwater management doesn't put any limits on it. What we've started to do in our reviews is we've had the developer put a chart on a recorded plan that says my basin's designed for either 3,500 square foot per lot, or each lot has its own specific limit, so that when that plan's recorded, that gets deeded, and then that's That's something that can be checked. But your stormwater management ordinance doesn't do anything to further preclude any type of impervious on your lot. So I mean, even 10 years down the line, when someone comes to put a pool in, there's nothing in the ordinance, unfortunately.
Yeah.
The second thing we did, and I don't want to go deep into stormwater, that's a long topic. So we tested Greg. We do individual lot grading plans for some other townships. So we took 7 other impervious coverage based upon lots. We took 3 based upon a half-acre lot, 3 based upon a full acre lot, and 1 based upon a 5 or 6 acre lot, and all of them fall underneath, which means acceptable and within the limits that are going to be set, well, that are proposed to be set by the brown line. So that's a guess. That was Upper Saucon Township, I'll just say. Upper Saucon Township, which is historically has larger structures in that township on bigger lots. So we just tested it, and it seems to match what was proposed with this brown line.
And to address the dot, as Tim has pointed out, on the upper chart, there is a dot on the green line. It's sort of sitting there all by its lonesome, way above the brown line at around 300,000 square foot lot. That was basically what spurred this. We got a very large house on a large lot a few years ago. And it's obviously above almost every line here. So it did exceed our current ordinance. And they did go to the zoning hearing board to request a variance, and I believe they were denied because of what's the hardship. So that is a large house on a large lot. So right now, this person has no recourse but to reduce the size of their house. What this ordinance is proposing is that you can indeed exceed these numbers on this chart. It would be a special exception approval of the zoning hearing board. And the applicant then would have to go to the zoning hearing board. It's a permitted use. They can do this, but the zoning hearing board can then attach reasonable conditions and safeguards to their proposal to ensure that they're protecting the neighbors from the additional impervious surface and associated development, including but not limited to light, noise, and stormwater runoff. So if, for example, this individual wanted to come in with their original house design, very large, 90,000 square feet, I believe, on a 6-acre lot, 3 stories, yeah, it was big. It was big. They could go to the zoning hearing board. That's a permitted use. The neighbors could come out and voice their concerns about additional stormwater, about additional light, noise, whatever. And the zoning hearing board could take that and put requirements on the developer to address that, to address the neighbors' concerns. And basically, that's how you would be able to have these houses to exceed these things. But it would be allowed to do so.
We punished that guy, though, because he could have made 8 lots in there and had more impervious coverage than what he was actually proposing to do.
Indeed.
And because it was an ostentatious sort of large house and the neighbors all came out, he got denied it. Quite frankly, shouldn't have been denied. He should have been able to build the house.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Mark, just to clarify, no neighbors came out. There was no complaints. It was strictly our ordinance and there was no hardship. And they had empathy with them. But because there was no hardship, they
Did
said
the neighbors that had the lot below come out?
there may
about
be
the
someone that came
stormwater?
out, but there was no complaints. I don't remember any complaints. I think it was strictly because the board was actually empathetic with him in stating it was just the hardship. He couldn't prove the hardship. And that's what, it was just the ordinance that held him back.
Yeah, unfortunately, their hands were tied.
To review this, to actually create something to help individuals that they shouldn't be penalized just because they're able to build a large house.
So under this particular chart, would he be able to build that house?
Yes,
Yes, but
it's a permitted use.
But you have to go for special exception.
Yes, you have to go to special exception, yes. And that would be residential. So if you adopt the PC recommendations, that would not go to PC because
They
it's-
could still make the mistake of denying him that special exception, then he'd have to take it to Lehigh County Court.
Good.
They could.
maybe Joe would have to answer it as far, I mean, a special exception is a use permitted by right with the exception that they have the ability to add conditions. Doesn't mean they have to. So if the zoning hearing board would deny that, Joe, can you speak to?
Sure. Special exception is presumed to be allowed as long as the objective criteria in the ordinance are met. When it comes to the subjective criteria in the ordinance, anyone objecting has a very heavy burden to show in order to have the special exception, because this goes for conditional use too, denied. What many boards don't properly recognize is when it comes to conditions being attached, it's not just really a matter of discretion by the body associated with the zoning board for special exception, governing body of the township for conditional use. The conditions that are imposed technically under the law must really apply to the objective criteria that are spelled out in the ordinance. Somehow a condition needs to be attached to fulfill the intent of those objective criteria. It can't be something just totally out in left field that has nothing to do with those criteria. And that part of the law is what most governing bodies and zoning hearing boards forget.
Now, I think ours is a fairly professional board. They've obviously got a good zoning hearing board solicitor advising them. So I would think if they tried to go against the zoning hearing board solicitor's advice, they'd be treading on thin ice.
I was also on that board, and when one came up with Pheasant Hills, the chairman said, well, who needs a house that big? Why should we give it to him? Well, that's not the question of whether he needs a house that big.
No.
You know, that's where I tend to,
Yeah. But this does give somebody an avenue that they don't have currently. So that individual could come back with this design, with his exact same design and get an approval.
So tell me what you have then on a 2-acre lot. What do you have available based on this?
On a 2-acre lot. Yeah, it's basically, let's see, I presented the area over 50,000 square feet. 2 acres is 86 something or other. Yeah. So basically it's 35 times 0.005 and then add 11,000 square feet. 15,000?
15,000? That's all you have out of 2 acres?
Mm-hmm. If you want to go higher, it's a special exception approval.
So on the special exception approval, you were saying conditions for stormwater. I just have a question on that. So if I'm building a large property, I'm disturbing over an acre, I've got to get a NIPD's permit. Aside from that, what conditions would anyone be attaching? You know, because they've got to account for all of the impervious at that point, right?
Yeah, and I would think the zoning hearing board, if they're attaching conditions, it would be the getting of the proper NTDS permitting.
Yeah, I guess the concern would be that they're exceeding the state requirements, and I don't know that we want to get into that, you know. So
right, and this would be up to the zoning hearing board solicitor to ensure that they're not putting in something that does exceed the state requirements legally.
Well, the state requirement is if you go over where you get an NIPD's and you account for your stormwater, but I could fully develop a property, my own property, and I could still then run into this situation where I beat your criteria, but yet I can get an NIPD's and actually have what I want on my property. I have to go to zoning.
Yeah, that's exactly my point as well. That you're duplicating the effort or exceeding it by having to go to zoning for that particular issue.
But right now, you really don't have recourse because you have to go for a variance and you have to prove a hardship. So right now, like that other individual, if you exceed, the standards now, the likelihood of you being granted anything is very small because it's very difficult to prove a hardship. At least here, we are giving an avenue so that it is a permitted use. Reasonable standards can be attached, but you'd be able to build your house or whatever you have to exceed that.
I don't know. It just sounds to me like we punish the person with a larger lot, which really should have more flexibility. You give a guy 80% on a 5,000 square foot lot, which I don't even know if that does that even exist here in the township, 5,000 square feet?
Oh, lots of them. Yes.
It's 80%, and the guy that actually has some land to move around, we have more control on him than we do on someone with 20,000 square foot lot.
One way to look at it, like many zoning provisions in a residential district, is that it's essentially aesthetic control. Why do you have a larger setback in certain residential zones? It's aesthetically driven. And that's really what you're doing here. And if that's the goal, then you have the prerogative to do that. But if you're only concerned about stormwater, then the state regulations take care of it.
And realistically speaking, looking at who this applies to, my standard was at least 90% of the properties out there fall into compliance with this. And I think it's actually higher than that. So yes, you're right. There are some large lot owners who, if they want really large houses, lots of impervious surface, they fall afoul of this. But for the most part, most residents of the township won't notice any change at all.
I think any way you look at it, what we're trying to do is ensure that a large development is done consistently against every other large development, whether it's a single resident or a multi-dwelling property like Toll Brothers.
Mm-hmm.
Before, he had no recourse. Now, if he puts in the same infrastructure to support the needs of the community for rainwater and all of that, he has an option. It may cost him more, absolutely, but at least the burden doesn't come back to us, the township, for him not securing.
You're always going to have an on-lot BMP regardless of what your design is. Correct? Even when you design the neighborhood, you're designing a regional basin, but that's only for the roads and the sidewalks and everything else. We're required to capture the roof, the driveway, the patios on lot.
But if I understand correctly.
Am I correct, Tony, on that?
There are developers that do take their own volume controls, including the house, on themselves, do a large infiltration basin or a spray irrigation system. So, but they're accounted for in the regional basin. That's their choice. Sometimes the HOA just turn it over to an HOA. The HOA owns it, and that's that. So there are some developers that still choose to. Other developers say it's on the homeowner, and that's on you. I
didn't understand what Greg said earlier is the goal in the next step with the ordinances would be to force the developer to plan for that and take care of it in that regional basin as opposed to on lot by the homeowner.
Mm-hmm.
I think what that would do is reduce the township's oversight in the MS4. So if there's one BMP, meaning one regional basin, township has to worry about that one regional basin as part of the MS4. If there is 45 infiltration ponds in the back of everyone's yard, even though they're owned and maintained by the homeowner, if they fail, the problem goes to the township. So that eliminates some of the oversight by the township.
And we also want to take a lot of that burden off the individual residences because they're responsible every 3 years to hire an engineer to go out and certify that these things work. And most of these people don't know that that's what they're in for when they buy the house. I've already talked to one person, his wife, and he worked in a title company. And he did, this guy's an expert at, a home sale. And he said, the BMPs did not come up in his search. He found out as he was signing the papers. And he said, if I had known this beforehand, I wouldn't have purchased this house.
So it's getting close to 10.
Are you going to collapse, Dave?
I'm fighting it. I think with the whole BMP conversation and the maximum impervious planning and the subdivision, that those again are steps that we'll take in the future. I think for tonight, as a baseline, the recommended impervious coverage seems to fit with over 90% of existing lots. So as staff, we feel that kind of sets the baseline. I do kind of feel like we need to investigate the exceptions to that, whether it's a special exception or we add some other provision in there. Because it doesn't sound like everybody's convinced that special exception is the way to go.
I think exceptions are a good alternative.
Okay.
I mean, I think inepties in some cases should have alternatives or exceptions, but it's the way it's written, there is no exception. If I have a 20-acre lot and I want to put my house in the middle of that 20 acres to get my driveway in there, build my house, do whatever, if I hit that acre, I got to get an empties permit. When my
Yes.
stormwater is not going to.
And so that's kind of
Yep.
what's going off in my head is we may not, if we send it to the zoning hearing board with special exception, that may not require engineering review because it's just going to the zoning hearing board. And that's kind of what the conversation we had earlier about non-residential development, having that engineering review where applicable and the conditions moving forward. If we have a residential, it doesn't fall under that provision. So there may be room for a plan to go through without engineering review. That's the thing that's kind of concerning me. But if we can tie it to a NEPDES permit, where if it has that permit, that may be the trigger for either special exception or a condition of that special exception. So that we're, like you said, if it's approved by the state, then it can go through, but that needs to be kind of spelled out, I think, is kind of what I'm feeling from everybody.
I mean, obviously, any applicant who triggers the state regulations is going to have to comply with that.
Yes.
So basically speaking, the only thing I see is, do they get the zoning hearing board approval first, or do they get it second? And I think if you walk into the zoning hearing board with your NPDES permit in hand, you're golden. But then you're making, I guess you're making a small leap that the zoning hearing board won't require you to, or won't attach certain conditions that will make you change the plan. On the other hand, if the zoning hearing board is adequately prepared, they can do as a condition, comply with the stormwater regulations, which they got to anyway.
Right. And I don't know if we put a provision in here that ties it to the NEPDES over an acre of disturbance, this percentage or percentages are exempt, or we can perhaps work something into that table to talk about some number over that.
Okay.
threshold.
So this seems like this has to be worked out a little bit more, and we'll take another.
I think one thing that will be helpful for us is whether the board agrees that this table is acceptable as a baseline. And then we can use that as the launching point for some of the other things we're discussing.
I would not agree to that. When I highlighted, no. I'd be more in a much simpler calculation than the algebra required to do what we're talking about. I would go flat percentages. Again, there's other safeguards involved with LVPC and an NEPDES. I don't think we need to be the hardest one to figure out what we're allowed to do on a lot.
Well, quite frankly, this stuff, I actually took to just regular old staff members and said, can you calculate what this is? And every one of them was able to calculate from this table.
I'm not saying I can't calculate from it. I'm just saying, why does it have to be so? I don't understand even the intent of it.
So my understanding is, when you're designing the subdivision, you're assuming a house size in each lot.
Mhm.
Then you design your basin, but then it's recorded and everything. Then a homeowner comes in. That lot was designed for X many square feet of impervious. They want to put a big back patio on. They want to put a big pool. They want to put a shed in their backyard. They're not allowed to do that because the original design did not account for that impervious cover. You see it with driveways. You start having to shave down the driveway because, so you have these homeowners come in and they can't build it, and then there's 100 new homeowners complaining that they can't build their backyard, their back deck, they can't put their in-ground pool in. And then in terms of the township, in order for those people to do that, each individual homeowner has to put in an infiltration trench, a rain garden, underground infiltration. Then there's 50 more BMPs that the township has to inspect and regulate. And then the homeowners, they don't know how to do the inspections and do the maintenance and upkeep for those infiltration facilities. So if it's all taken care of up front, which this does, it makes it easier. Now, yes, the developer is going to have to provide larger facilities to account for it, but it takes a lot of this guesswork and problems that occur out, it eliminates a lot of those issues.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the concept, is that we're building the table as the foundation of what we want to do later. And what we want to do later is take a lot of the burden off the township and the individual homeowners. And unfortunately, it's got to go on somebody's shoulders, and that's going to be the developer, which is something that we constantly do around here. If there's a new regulation, it's how do you build a development? How do you build a house? Adding to that. If you want safer homes, if you want, better streets, if you want stuff like that, somebody's got to do it. And generally the developers are the ones who have the expertise to actually get it done. So
I'm just going to put this one out there, Dave or staff, maybe think about for later, but if we're going to set these parameters for what the maximum impervious per lot, and the developer is establishing that with the domestic dreams of at least 90% of the development's occupants, I don't see it in here, but you're probably going to have to plan for bartering and trading within that development over the course of time. Lot owner A, no?
No.
No.
No. When the Nebius permit is closed out and that development is done, then they become secondary permits, which is where an individual lot grading plan could come into play if there is one. Not one.
And the conservation district now on NIPD's permits, they make you put a list on the PCSM plans. This lot is allowed X many square feet of impervious cover, and that's all you're allowed. And the problem that homeowners run into is they don't know stormwater, so they don't know that it's recorded that they're only allowed X many square feet.
And
So-
what we want on that table is to match
Yeah,
this.
so you just max.
So that's it, and
The
we're done.
stormwater design has to be done to be designed to account for the max allowable.
I think there's a second part to this too, is that there's houses, you lived in your house 10 years, that MPDS permit is closed, doorknob, and it's gone. And the township still has to deal with it because my house drains to a detention basin. So 10 years later, the conservation district doesn't care what I do because we're already closed out, the permit's done. So now the township's the one that has a burden to make sure that that basin doesn't flood. So if I add 5,000 square feet and then my neighbor does, and then that guy's neighbor does. And before you know it, you have an acre of impervious going to that basin. Now that basin's either overtopping or it has more discharge than that's allowed. So I think that it's not just bought into the first 5 years of the first MPDS permit, but this is kind of one of these things that 20 years down the line, there's still going to be someone that wants a pool or a deck or a patio. So I think that this is a continuous effort that to set the standards so that we know how to do that. I think, stormwater is kind of this limit and stormwater are kind of getting back and forth with each other because I think this is just a limit on lot impervious. Stormwater is a whole nother ballgame, but I think that, it's definitely an important issue.
One way to think about it, given Mark Luth's concern about this maybe hamstringing property owners, developers too much, if the township were to move forward with what Greg has suggested, the staff have talked about, where in the future, developers are going to need to design and construct for maximum impervious coverage for the entire development, each lot in the development. If this chart that we have here were to be more generous, that means you're going to have more and more and more detention basins that need to be built, less developable land because it's going to be more basins. So from that perspective, one might view this as not being onerous on development, but actually helpful because it's capping it at a more reasonable level than what would potentially result in humongous and many detention basins, if that's the direction the ordinance goes.
And that's exactly why I wanted that 90% is to not get extreme, because the moment we could bend the line upward, but then you'd have to design for that additional stormwater. And that can be problematic at the higher end. So we wanted to do that, but still give every property owner the right to add more impervious surface through the special exception. That was really the point. We didn't want to say no to anyone. We wanted to allow everyone the avenue of, if I have the money to be able to do what I want, I can do what I want. And that was kind of the whole thought behind this. I mean, I can certainly go in and bend that line from the brown line to the blue line. That's easy enough to do. Or the gray line, or the green line. I really don't want to go up to this reddish line.
So I think my suggestion is we use this as the starting point. We'll come back with a simpler version of this. The other piece we have this impervious coverage that we're wrestling with. We also have a service pack that we want to get done. So if we don't feel that the impervious coverage is ready, we can always pull this back out of the service pack, address that so that we move the service pack through, because there's a lot of changes in that service pack that are going to be helpful moving forward. So that's the other piece of this conversation and why it's structured like this. If we're struggling with something, we can pull it out and address it later separately as in its own topic. And based on the amount of time we spent on this impervious coverage discussion, I think it warrants possibly pulling it out of the service pack, addressing it as a separate ordinance update, so that we can move the rest of the service pack forward. Because I don't want to spend another meeting spending, a half an hour talking about impervious coverage when we have 90% of the service pack ready to go.
But then does that put us back to square one on the impervious coverage issue, and it's going to take that much longer to get this accomplished? Does it make sense to just do this at our next meeting and have all of the service pack in one packet ready to go, since we've come this far?
We can certainly try that.
Yeah.
But I think we'll clean it up, and for the next meeting we'll have it, but I think that's an option for the board.
And certainly what I can do is not start with this, but end with it. Address, because we only have 10 more issues. and in 17 pages, so that tells you the simplicity of all of them. So we can certainly do that.
I mean, I'm almost rather see you keep the current calculation and just change it to a special exception. I mean, you're taking the lowest bar on a graph and saying because it covers 90%, it's the right thing to do.
Well, the problem is that this still does not help the individuals who.
Well, look, I mean, I can go to the Winchester across the street, and almost every builder that builds in there comes to us first and says, what do I got on this lot? You have 6,500 square feet. That's what you can work with. Anything after that's a minor mod. Minor mod will take you 3 months, $8,000, and you can put more on it. You're just going to have to put another BMP on the lot. Every homeowner has to okay that. So they're all aware that at this point in the stage of the game, when I start talking about 20,000 square foot lots, 30,000 square foot lots, I'm going to have to do something on lot. And they all signed an operations and maintenance agreement as part of their deed. So the idea that the individual homeowner is so naive, doesn't know anything about it, they know something about it. They know there's a maintenance agreement with it. If it gets by 5 people and the guy finds out later on down the road, he's going to have to deal with it. He owns it. It's his. I mean, this was a state requirement that basically every township adopted with dry wells, infiltration pits. I mean, it's more commonplace now than it ever has been.
And it will get more commonplace.
Yeah.
It's just that we're seeing a lot of residents come in. Like I said, everyone signs it, but when you buy a house, you just sign.
I don't even think that's really at the root of this chart.
No.
You know, we're talking about individual lots or somebody in an established neighborhood wants to put in a patio. I think that's where this chart is applied. Eventually it'll be used for the BMP conversation, but right now this chart is really for adding impervious. Is the impervious coverage by lot size across the township, regardless of new subdivision.
Yeah.
But I think what we'll do is we'll clean this up, try and simplify, iron out this special exception part, put it at the back of the service pack. That'll give us an opportunity to get through the rest of the service pack. And if we get to impervious coverage and we're still struggling with it, we can always pull it out of the service pack. So I think that gives us a game plan for the next meeting.
That's a good game plan. Are we moving forward with the other ones, or are we?
Up to you.
That too.
I can't.
What I would say is you've all had a chance to look
Make a
at
motion to
the
adjourn.
rest of them. Does anybody see anything in the last stuff that's crazy?
I mean, I have some
Yeah,
questions. I prefer to go through it in a meeting.
let's table it till next month.
Okay.
We should go through it. You want to make?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
We're not done yet.
Well, we already reviewed the comp plan.
Oh, well, we got to go to.
Courtesy of the floor and infrastructure.
Transportation infrastructure.
Yep. Transportation infrastructure update.
All right, guys, I'll make this quick. Last LVTS meeting, Jordan Greenway was discussed, so that's a big thing for the township. Everyone's excited for that, so that's moving forward. There were some bridge-related items, not really related to our township. And just so everyone knows, we're past the wearing course for PennDOT. It's past November 15th, so no more wearing course. Obviously, the temperatures don't help, so you should start to see a lot of things wrapped up in the paving world. You know, kind of seal coated and done, and not starting up for a couple months. So that's all I got. Keep it short.
Great. Courtesy of the floor. Anyone in the audience or online?
Next month. Bridge Farm, final plan, phase 1C. We do have a small lot line adjustment, Huckleberry Road and somewhere else. It's Huckleberry Road, Penn's Crossing and Huckleberry Road. We have Parkland School District, new operations center is coming in preliminary final plan. And last but not least, we may have a revised sketch plan for 1429 Eck Road